Episode 9, Truth is Stranger Than Fiction, Old School Hacking and Intriguing Washington, D.C. Hey, welcome to the show, everyone. My name is Stephen Lee. I'm your Cyber Riskers host, and we are joined by our special guest today, Rob Shein. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Thank you.
Rob,
wow. Go ahead.
Rob, so you have experience working with the US government, Fortune 500 companies, and you also mentioned in your bio that you used to work with computers 40 years ago. Can you tell me what computers were like? What were computers actually like 40 years ago? Because it's hard for me to even imagine that.
Yeah. The idea of Moore's law that a computer's processing power, an average computer's processing power, will double every 18 months to 2 years. Take the computer you have now and work backwards, cut it in half, because about 18 months is actually what the period was for most of that time. And you end up with this like microscopic amount of processing power. The first computer I ever programmed on when I was a child, I was very lucky. It was an Apple II Plus. The school I went to was very well funded, and they had a guy who had a really good understanding of what was coming. So what he did was he pushed for some funding to buy these computers because he knew that he saw the computer revolution coming far in advance. He absolutely predicted the things that happened. So these computers had 48K of RAM, 48K. There's no megabytes. Nothing had a megabyte of RAM back then. The processor was made by MOS and it ran at 1 megahertz. By the way, these computers were wildly upgraded. These were very nice. The Apple II Plus came with 8K of RAM.
So this was like leading edge, state of the art. And what could you actually do with these computers from 40 years ago?
The graphics were pretty rudimentary. Programming languages were also pretty straightforward. Out of the box, the thing would run, you could do assembly, which is, you're working in hex. I eventually got into that, which came in handy later. And the main thing was what's called AppleSoft Basic, which was just ANSI Basic with, if there was anything about it that wasn't to the ANSI spec, I never came across it. So later on, you had some other programming languages you could use, like Logo and so on, but it was fairly rudimentary. You didn't have a lot of power at your dispense. That came later.
Got it. So take us 10 years into the future now, and you've got this interesting story where it's the year 2000. You meet an interesting character in DEF CON, and you have an interesting client.
Yeah. So let's see. Let's get started. So first, I've got to put a few disclaimers out there. This is my presentation. These are my opinions, my thoughts. These are not of any current or past employer. So if I say anything wrong, if anyone objects, it's me. It's all me. The vulnerabilities and the risks that I'm about to talk about have all been addressed a long time in the past. It's the only reason I feel even remotely comfortable talking about this. And this was also, culturally speaking, 20 years ago. The cybersecurity world was a very different place. This was before 9/11. This was just as Microsoft was beginning to come around, and they went through this major shift where they took security very differently with regards to their products. Before that, they were resistant, as pretty much everybody was, as far as the software world was concerned. Companies often did all sorts of nasty things to try to keep vulnerabilities from being disclosed and to try to discourage security researchers. Frivolous lawsuits, all kinds of threats, like all kinds of stuff. We all know that it didn't work, but this was back when that was still getting sorted out. And as a consequence, security researchers typically used handles. Mine back then was, ironically, was a word in Japanese, shoten, which is focus. It's a focus point. Now, I have never told this entire story before in its complete form, and everything I'm about to say is totally real and absolutely happened. So with that, how did it begin? I worked with a guy who was not technical. He was my manager, but his way of dealing with technical things was he would have an alpha geek sort that he would bring with him to meetings, have, participate on phone calls with him, that kind of a thing, and essentially do tech to business translation. And I ended up being that guy. And on one of these calls, we were just about to hang up, giving up on winning a bit of business. But I said to him, I was like, hang on a sec, let me jump in here, and basically spoke a little bit. I had grasped what the client from the Treasury Department, this is who it was talking about and what they were really worried about. And I knew that we could absolutely take care of what they needed. So I jumped in, and in a matter of about 60 seconds, we basically got the work. So the job was to assess a commercially off-the-shelf available VPN for vulnerabilities using a black box approach. It was like total hacker type. You're an adverse actor. You've managed to get a copy of the software, and you want to find a way to hack it. This VPN was going to be implemented in what was called TICS, the Treasury Communication System. It's the backbone of comms within the Treasury Department, which has all sorts of stuff going on. FinCEN, the Treasury itself, I believe the U.S. Mint. TICS provides their secure backbone for communications and also provides remote access. Even then, and back then, it was an even bigger deal, because Customs, Border Patrol, Secret Service, these were all part of the Treasury. Instead of now, they're part of DHS. So there were a lot of really, really sensitive things that run over TICS. So I put together a team. Now, got working quick. 4 guys from my team, plus I needed a crypto expert. And the good news was there was this really brilliant guy I had met just months earlier at DEF CON when I saw him speak. And we talked, and we basically had this whole long thing together, kind of an adventure.
And Rob, just pause there. Take us back. What was DEF CON like back in those days, by the way?
DEF CON has always been, I'm actually wearing a DEF CON shirt from DEF CON 20 now in commemoration here. DEF CON has always been a remarkable thing. I don't even have a word for it. It's more culturally significant than a conference, but it defies analogy practically. Now it's enormous. I mean, it's a massive thing with, I think, getting around 20,000 people who attend. Back then it was smaller. It was smaller and wilder. I could give a whole talk on that. There's a cultural history around DEF CON that actually should be a book at some point. But the long story short is DEF CON would be this sort of ad hoc universe of computer security people, both defensive and offensive. When I first started going was just as they were getting to that point where Spot the Fed was still a thing, and there was still a lot of distrust over people who were fetish, but the feds were no longer quite trying to, they were getting over this assumption that everyone there was a criminal. And in fact, most of the people there, I would say, absolutely were not and had not broken the law. There were all sorts of little things that would go on. And there'd be all sorts of like strange events. Like one of the things that helped me bond with Ender, who's the crypto expert, well, he was a member of the Ghetto Hackers group. And that year they won Capture the Flag. Up to getting really close to Sunday morning when it ends, they hadn't really had a lot of success. It was one of those Capture the Flags where people were having trouble planting flags. Capturing flags off of other people's servers. And so at this point, I think we were getting close to dawn, maybe a little past it, after everyone had done an heavily intellectual all-nighter and drinking at the same time. That happens at DEF CON too. We figured out that we could black bag and get into the data center for Capture the Flag that had everyone's servers. Now, I actually ended up participating in this to some degree with the Ghetto Hackers, which was a blast. Well, Ender and another guy from his group got inside, and they were surprised to find a security guard with a clipboard of all the people who were allowed in. Well, the funny thing is, this was a sort of a security oversight on the part of DEF CON. They're back to everyone having handles. The list of names was handles of all the people that were allowed in. And the one thing about a hacker alias is that you don't have ID. So there's no way to prove that whoever they say they are is who they say they are. And Ender got a look at the clipboard, just a glance, and he saw a name up at the top, Zach. So he said, I'm Zach. And he sold it. And the security guard bought it. And so he and his colleague managed to go around. It's like, yeah, we just got to check some stuff. And they went around to every single server. And if you have physical access to a box, it's far easier to hack. And they just basically just grabbed flags. You know, they offloaded flags or they planted flags. I forget what it was that year. If you had to plant or grab, it changes. But yeah, and this is a big sensation at DEF CON because people loved it. And the thing is, with DEF CON, it actually wasn't against the rules. They hadn't thought about that, so they changed the rules after that. But yeah, Ender was a really brilliant guy. Is one of those guys who taught himself high mathematics. He just had the mind for it. It was crazy, and he was a good guy too. I mean, he was a good person. I got to see what he was like when he was really tired. I got to see how he thought things through, you know, after some alcohol and fatigue. And I was like, this, you know, he didn't get a little wobbly like some people did. So I felt comfortable with him. So I wanted him on my team because he had skills that we needed to go after something I wanted to look at. Also, we didn't have a lab facility, so we had to figure that one out to do this job. Back to the main topic. And then at that point, the company I worked for started laying people off. So when the time came to do the work, it was just me and Ender and our boss. Everyone else had been laid off. Our boss was nervous, but we were very, you know, gambarimasu. I felt like we could do this because at this point I'd been speaking more with Ender and we'd been thinking about how we'd go after this and what we thought the weak parts were. And I told my boss, you know, Bob Ritchell, who I'd like to say a few words of praise for, is a fantastic man to work for, great guy. Like I said, he was not at all technical, but he was one of those people who really understood that management was a job skill in and of itself, a set of skills, I should say. And he was marvelous. And he had great war stories because he had been in the DEA from the founding of it until he retired as a deputy administrator. So like he'd been undercover in other countries, he'd done all this stuff, he'd been shot, you know, and so on and so on. He was a fantastic guy. So back on track. Ender flies in from Seattle, we get to work. I managed to rent some equipment for the lab, got that taken care of. Bob was fascinated watching us work, like two hackers just going crazy, like drooling over the stuff they're gonna do. You know, he was nervous. He was like, "Oh, how's this going to work out?" But he supported. He stayed out of the way, that kind of a thing. And the way that we controlled costs for the project actually helped the way we worked, I think. Instead of putting him in a DC hotel, which is very expensive, put him up in a bed and breakfast down the street. He stayed for several weeks, you know, without flying back to Seattle. I said, like, you know, it'll be fun. You won't have to worry about expenses for food. I'll feed him, you know, and I'll drive him around. We'll hang out together anyways. So, you know, you won't have to worry about a rental car. And I lived in Adams Morgan in DC, which is like a really fun neighborhood. So, you know, even if he wanted time to himself, it's easy to get around. There's good stuff around there. So this leads to what a day in the life was like when we did this. We'd wake up around 8 in the morning. He'd come over to my place, my apartment, about 9:30, and we'd start planning the day's activities, what we were going to do while having coffee. This was the late .com era, and Northern Virginia is a huge tech center, so traffic was a disaster back then. So we'd drive in around 10 o'clock. So it would only take about half an hour to get to work instead of about 90 minutes of stop and go. We would start work at 10:30. stop for lunch at about 1. We'd talk about work all through lunch anyways. Get back to the lab, keep working. We'd leave the office around 6:30. Listen to music, grab groceries on the way home, eat around 8:30. And then we'd just basically go back to work because we were fascinated. We'd be looking through things like packet captures or documentation, any notes we'd written up for the day, looking through file structures. It was different every time. It was just whatever our natural curiosity led towards. And this would be mixed in with one of us playing Unreal Tournament on my home computer. And the whole time we'd be like having some like nice Trappist ale, sometimes wine. And then at midnight, Andrew would go back to the bed and breakfast, and we'd just basically crash and go to sleep. Sleep like the dead, and then wake up in the morning, start all over again. So I'm just sort of free associating just sort of the thoughts I put down on the slides. Is how's this coming across? Is this making any sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's taking us into what the lifestyle of a hacker looks like, and it just seems like cybersecurity is integrated into your lifestyle,
Yeah, it absolutely was. I mean, I'd wake up in the morning and I would check a few different sources of information. They're totally different now. Now you have Bleeping Computer, Krebs on Security. Back then it was more Internet Storm Center. Well, they're still around. ISC, Packet Storm was really big back in the day. There's a couple others I'm trying to remember, but God, this was like 20 years ago. So yeah, so one of the first things I had to figure out is, how do you go about attacking a VPN? Like, how do you look? You really do have to plan something like this. You can't just take it off the top of your head. You have to have a plan of action. So the first thing I thought about is what makes a VPN a VPN. There's basically 3 primary functions it has to have. It has to have authentication, who are you? Because it shouldn't let just anyone through. That defeats the whole point. It should have encryption because it's supposed to protect the data in transit. Otherwise, again, what's the point? It's just a router at that point. And it has to have authorization because you're going to have differences in what people will need to access. So those are the 3 big ones. Read the documentation. I couldn't believe, oh my God, when we read the docs, it was almost like if you wrote a playbook telling someone what to go after. And there were so many clues of possible problems from the documentation because it talked about the reason for the way the VPN worked the way it did. So the other thing is reversing. You want to look at the traffic because that'll give you a sense of how to do a network-based attack. Like look at the structure of the packets that are in the clear. And you can look at what's encrypted and see if the VPN's working the right way. There's not that much you're going to learn by looking at that because it's just going to be heavily obfuscated. But if that's not the case, then that's a problem with the VPN as well. And then also look at the software. You have the server-side software and the client-side software. And if you sort of break it down, a piece of software is a large number of files. And within each file, like each file has its own role. And several of those handle, they're basically programming functions. And if you look in those, you can see the parts that do the different things. There was one aspect of this VPN that was intended to be acceptable for use overseas, despite the fact that it used strong encryption. You see, back then, the US government had basically the law called strong encryption munitions, ITAR, which is used to control the transfer of military hardware, also applied to 128-bit encryption. It's ridiculous, but they had a workaround here where if you captured the entire session and then you went with a warrant to the owner of that VPN system, they could give you a key to decode it after the fact, which is a security problem in a couple of ways. Number one being that it didn't have forward secrecy. Number two was they were like, oh, we've got like strong passwords. You have to use multi-factor to access that. I'm like, yeah, but you can just pull the DLL off the disk and just do the calls directly and do it that way. That's a problem. That's a structural issue. But at the same time, for what Treasury wanted to do, this thing would have to work overseas. And if you have to worry about ITAR, that's a nightmare. So I kind of get it. There was a solid business decision behind all of this, and there were some real drivers behind that. So that's one of the problems with trying to weaken crypto, is you have these adverse effects. Last thing with reversing is play with the UI. A lot of applications that have a dedicated client, the UI will keep you from doing certain things. Those client-side protections. Find out what those things are. One of the great ones was the username maximum was 31 characters. It wouldn't let me put a username of 32 characters in there. And that ended up being a really important clue for later. Because when an attacker goes after something, they're never going to use the client. They're going to write their own software that pretends to be the client and essentially it has none of the restrictions this has. And that's what we did. We found extremely bad things. The problem with the encryption scheme was one factor, but that wasn't a direct route to breaking this, because you still needed something off the server. What made that possible was we found a buffer overflow with remote code execution. And these vulnerabilities were unauthenticated. You didn't need to have an account. You didn't need to log in first. Any stranger could have hit the box from the outside and done this. And a lot of buffer overflows don't work every single time, but this one did. It was the most reliable vulnerability I'd ever seen, really.
So, Rob, this sounds like a major vulnerability.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I should probably explain a buffer overflow. They're a lot more rare these days for several reasons, but they're extremely nasty. Imagine you're going into an office building where there's a security guard physically checking your ID. You have to hand your ID to them. Okay, so you hand the ID to them, they look at it, they decide whether you're allowed in or not. Okay, no problem. In the real world, objects can't overwrite other objects. If you try to like throw a person at another person, they bump into each other and one of them gets knocked over. But inside a computer's memory, that's not what happens. What happens is one thing overwrites another. So imagine if instead of so let's say you've got Sato-san is the security guard, and Kenji-san is someone who'll do whatever I say. So what I do is I take Kenji-san and I attach him to my ID, and then I hand my ID over, and my ID lands in Sato-san's hands, and Kenji-san completely obliterates Sato-san and takes his place. He now functions as a security guard in that company. So he has the ability to go anywhere he wants. He can let me in the front door. He can escort me into sensitive areas where I wouldn't be allowed, even if I was allowed in there, so on and so on. That's a buffer overflow, where essentially what you do is you end up injecting your own software into the memory of the computer by adding it to whatever you would put into that buffer. In this case, it was that username. If you hit 32 characters, you were overwriting the space, 32 or maybe a little more, I forget exactly, but you were overwriting the space that was allocated to store the input as was expecting. And so if you add what's called shellcode after that, that's essentially software that will run inside the system, and it'll do whatever you want. The other thing we found was a one packet denial of service. You essentially gave it bad keying material, and as long as you kept the connection open, it was expecting more, it would just wait. But then when you close the connection, It would then try to process it. It wouldn't make sense, and the system would peg at 100% processor utilization. It would seize up, and it would stay seized until you restarted it completely. So really, really, really bad stuff, and it wasn't that hard to find. We had other stuff we wanted to get started on too, but when you find a critical vulnerability like that, you always call the client right away because they have to know. A lot of times they have to make some business decisions about that, which will govern the way everything else follows. So call them immediately. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so you called the client immediately, and what was their reaction, and what did you find out?
Well, it was an interesting meeting. So went over to where they were. The client in this case, you had the government agency itself, but you had DynCorp, was the contractor who was supporting them. It turned out that the client, yes, Treasury was looking at this for ticks, but this was actually for the United States Secret Service, and that's who we were working for the protective detail of the incoming Bush administration, who had just been elected in a very contentious election. This was W. Bush, by the way. And this was intended to protect all of their communications, including their VoIP for phone. And also, this is the real kicker, the VPN was already installed in Secret Service's primary infrastructure and was in production. Like the firewall pair that was protecting the Secret Service in general, including their headquarters. I'm not going to say where that is. The protective part of them, it was on the firewall. Back then, a lot of firewall solutions, like for example, Checkpoint, there were software packages you would install on an operating system. So you would have maybe Solaris running Checkpoint, and a lot of times they would install the VPN as well, because that way you had the same point. You didn't have to let traffic through the firewall that wasn't yet acceptable to get the VPN to work. So, secure that way. Yeah, so that was a very interesting day. I remember the meeting very well, and I really remember the feeling afterwards. Bob was like, "Oh, go ahead."
I was gonna say,
Go ahead.
it sounds like it's one of those very unusual days where alcohol really helps in the situation of high stakes.
Well, I mean, that evening we drank a lot. I don't know if the alcohol helped because I haven't had an evening like that ever at another time to compare. Bob was like, "Oh my God, we're gonna make history," and I had to say like, "Yeah, but no one's gonna know about it." Ender and I were like, "Oh my God, we're like the Secret Service is vulnerable, is really vulnerable, and we're the only two people on the planet, hopefully, who know about it and know how to do it." And it's like, you have that strange feeling where you're like, there's bad people out there who would pay a lot of money for this. The really funny thing was the absolute lack of temptation. I didn't expect that. I was like, that's funny. I would think that I would at least be a little bit tempted, but I'm not even remotely like, oh my, I'm just mostly horrified that I know this, and I'm excited about this whole role, but it seems like this would be more fun if I was in a movie. It's not quite the same in real life. That got a little weirder too. The vendor was a company called V1. They were a startup. They were on the verge of doing an IPO. Now, remember, I said this was at the end of the dot-com era. So they saw their window closing, their chance to get paid, because back then, IPOs, everybody became millionaires or multimillionaires. And the Northern Virginia area was just full of them. There was so many people who'd gotten rich from things like AOL, and so on. And these guys wanted to do it too. So they had their own set of motivations. DynCorp was in a tough spot because they were a little bit embarrassed by this, but at the same time, it's like, didn't do anything wrong. looking at it from the perspective of the way this thing functioned, this VPN made sense. It would have solved a lot of problems and it would have made things work really well. Now, the ones who really impressed me were the Secret Service. The professionalism that they showed is unlike anything I ever saw. There would be meetings where literally everyone in the room was an equal. I was a younger guy with long hair. I had long hair like between my shoulder blades. I looked like a hacker. I had the goatee, the long hair, that kind of a thing. And in these meetings, I don't even want to say the titles, but these were unbelievably high up people. And they talked to me as a peer, and everyone gave everyone respect. Didn't matter the age, didn't matter what your skill set was, didn't matter what your rank was, who was the client, who was the vendor. It's like they just cared about doing the right thing. So impressive. And yeah, like I said before, yeah, we drank a lot of Belgian ale that night. And we just sort of sat there like, geez, like what did we get ourselves into? This is, well, we're always going to remember it. So the big question is when you're in this position where you've got these different players playing it out, what do? You have to work this out. So as things ended up, V1 tried just about every trick in the book. They hinted at lawyers, and the Secret Service kind of put an end to that. They fixed the bugs that we found, but then they did everything they could to slow down our availability to information to finish our research. And because Ender was visiting from Seattle, he had a ticking clock on how long he'd be around, and our lab was rented equipment. So we had a ticking clock on research. At the same time, the company I worked for was already in the process of scaling down the group I belonged to. They had just been acquired by somebody else. And the security group became kind of the redheaded stepchild, which is to say that we were the child that they didn't want in the family. So, that our time was limited there too. The Secret Service and Treasury eventually went with a totally different VPN solution. The question came up, so they fixed these problems, but overall, do you think that's it, or do you think there might be more trouble waiting? I said, the way these guys have acted, these problems, they should have been able to catch this. Things like sanitizing your inputs, not counting on the client to protect the buffer. These are not mistakes you make when you're making a security product like a firewall or a VPN. Like, this was amateur hour stuff. And the way they've acted, these guys, I don't think that they've changed their minds and have aggressively gone to improve their software. So I would be concerned. So Secret Service went elsewhere. V1 eventually did not IPO. They were bought by some other small startup that themselves was bought. The product was still terrible. Years later, there were some other vendors that basically OEM'd it as part of a larger solution, and we'd see that they had issues. And I ended up writing a book, not a good book. It wasn't meant to be Shakespeare, nor was it. The DC thing you do, if you can't talk about what happened, is you write a novel that addresses what happened or something like what happened, or maybe like how it could have gotten worse if something had happened. You get that into the hands of staffers and you try to initiate change through that. And that's actually what I did with this book. Ender had a character in the book who I called Mad Fast. He and I were both driving enthusiasts. And there was a joke that we had read while in the midst of things. Oh, I'm sorry, it was on the first night. That's right. Rainforest Puppy had written his, what vulnerability was that? Basically, there's a vulnerability in Windows, a really nasty one, where the guys on the bug track or NT bug track, I think it was NT bug track, were like talking about it, but holding it back and playing it up. So he got really angry. This guy, Rainforest Puppy, he was a hacker, and figured out himself what the vulnerability was, and then did this whole disclosure. And in the middle, he had a part where, and this is classic hacker humor, the NSA was still working on figuring out what the new AES standard would be. And so we had a little clip in there that says, and now a commercial break, XOR, the unofficial AES candidate. Now, XOR is not really encryption. It's something that a lot of companies would use to try to obfuscate data, and it's just not at all even remotely secure. And this was satire. So, advantages of XOR, it's mad fast. That was one of them. So that was our joke, Ender and I, about something. It's mad fast. Oh, it's mad fast. We gave a talk at DEF CON in 2001 based on this project, where we demonstrated the vulnerability, described it without revealing names, and we cracked that joke. So mad fast. Ender now mad fast, and I ended up later working on the same team, doing this kind of work all the time, along with all kinds of other crazy things. And there's other stories with that.
So just before we wrap up and go into questions, Rob. So the interesting thing that I take away from this story is that one, obviously your technical skills helped identify the vulnerabilities, but the second challenge as a security professional was instigating the change, or the action, the change which would help your client overcome these problems. And in that story, you had a lot of resistance from the vendor, which was what was the name? It was something one?
V1.
V1. So you had a lot of resistance, pushback from them to basically stop you from doing your job. And I think security professionals come across that in some way or shape or form from their clients, or even from their own internal stakeholders. And that could be due to a variety of reasons. It could be vested interests, or it could also be different perspectives on things. And I think the second part you described is something that's really important to build upon in your career, to get to to move from like a senior associate to move to a manager level, from what I've seen.
I agree with that. So part of the reason why I outlined the different players is that they all had different motivations. V1's interest happened to be in conflict of interest. I mean, at the end of the day, all of this was about protecting people. I was protecting the Secret Service. Secret Service was protecting President and others, and so on. These are what the goals were. The technology was to protect the communications. That's how it was. V1's interests were about having this major contract, which would give them a large boost to their revenues, a marquee client, and then allow them to IPO. So that's not, in no way does that inherently align with this. And when they were in a position where they had to suddenly consider that maybe their product was not so secure, it became a conflict of interest. DynCorp was caught in the middle because they had this blow up in their face, but they weren't, they were cooperative with us. This wasn't their fault. And this kind of testing was extremely rare back then, unusual skill sets. So it's not that they should have had it tested sooner or something like that. That's a hard thing to do. It was a presidential directive itself that caused this testing to happen in the first place. That's what it took. And DynCorp was constrained by acquisition rules. So the key takeaway is for a vendor, absolutely work with security researchers. Do not resist. Almost always, these are well-intentioned people. They just want to do the right thing. And their intents align with those of your clients. So understand that if you are resistant to what they want to do, you're probably, in a sense, going to end up going to war with your own client at some point. And that's not a good situation.
Thanks for sharing that, Rob. And just some quick questions from the audience before we wrap up. Rob, are you still doing hacking activities as a hobby or playing capture the flag?
CTF is something that it's one of those things that I did kind of a bit, and it was cool, but it's not my main thing.
Mm,
I don't really do it. Hacking, I haven't done that since I came to Japan because the laws were a little iffy here. And back at home, I had a whole lab set up, and I would do testing and that kind of a thing. I haven't done a penetration test in several years. The last thing I hacked was my own car. But I also had a bit of a scary situation with that at one point, which has convinced me to be more careful about actually doing something to a car with 350 horsepower while it's running.
that sounds like another story in itself.
That's another story in and of itself, yeah. But
Just
yeah, so
yeah.
I have helped with some hardware reverse engineering while in Japan. I tend now to focus on sort of the broader programmatic way, like how do you prevent the vulnerabilities? In IoT, a lot of this is about process because the company that makes a device isn't usually the company that creates the vulnerabilities that are in it. There's all these third-party
Mm.
vendors that make components that go into it, and that takes a slightly different approach.
Got it. Just one last question. Hopefully this one makes sense. It's text or code editor IDE of choice.
Oh, oh wow, those are like multiple questions. Okay, text editor, I love Sublime. That's my thing. IDE of choice. Depends on the language. I'm doing Python now. What am I using for Python? I can't even remember it. Hang on a second. Oh, that's right. It's on that computer. I'm doing my Python. Yeah,
We can still see your screen, by the way.
yeah, I found a Python IDE. I fell in love with it, and I haven't even noticed what it's called anymore because I just launch it. Is there a way to get an answer back to that person later?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Okay.
There is. Yeah. So please reach out. Please reach out to Rob with that question, and he'll get back to you. So as we wrap up, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rob. Any concluding remarks before we wrap up?
No, just thank you to everyone for coming. I hope this was interesting to you. It was definitely one of the more interesting times in my life, and I look back upon it very fondly, and with a much lower pulse and blood pressure than I had at the time. So, thank
Hey,
you.
thanks for sharing your story, Rob. And I think there's a lot of lessons for security professionals out there. And to everyone listening, thanks for your support. This is actually our last Cyber Riskers webinar for the year. Next year we're starting again, and we are honored to have Robert Veras, who's the Chief Information Security Officer from Oryx, share his story and his journey to CISO. So I hope you can join us for that special session. The other thing we have is we have the 2020 Cyber Riskers Mentoring Program finishing, and the next one for 2021 will start early next year, sometime in Q1. So keep your eye out for applications there. And I hope you guys have a really great rest of the year, and we'll see you next year. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rob, and see you guys all later. Bye-bye for now.